Imagine this, a world swallowed by water. Towers of dark clouds spiral like living beasts, lightning carving furious veins across the sky. And an ocean, wild, rising, unstoppable, devouring entire landscapes in a single night. It's the kind of scene we relegate to myth. Noah desperately sealing the last wooden plank of his ark as the first waves crash against it, or Gilgamesh watching the heavens split open as the gods unleash a storm meant to erase humanity from existence. But what if these legendary floods were more than symbolic warnings? What if they were memories, distorted by time, passed through generations, of a catastrophe so immense, so world-shaping, that our ancestors could only preserve it in the form of epic tales? What if humanity truly witnessed the end of a world once before, roughly 12,800 years ago? Our story begins long before the first cities rose, before kings, empires, or the earliest written alphabets. The Earth then was thawing from the grip of the Ice Age, its surface reshaping drop by drop as ancient glaciers receded. What might surprise you is that this transition was far from peaceful. It was a precarious balance, a slow dance between warming climates and the frozen giants that still dominated the northern parts of the world. Beneath this fragile calm, life flourished. Vast herds of mammoths roamed sweeping plains of golden grasses. Enormous ground sloths lumbered under the sun. Saber-toothed cats measured their territory in silent confidence. And scattered among these beasts were early humans. Small bands of hunters and wanderers who tracked game, followed rivers, and read the sky as their only calendar. To them, the world must have seemed stable, eternal, almost predictable. Seasons returned. Ice slowly melted, forests expanded. Nothing suggested that nature was brewing a storm powerful enough to slam the planet backward into an age of cold and darkness. Yet somewhere above, drifting silently through the void, an intruder approached. It had no name, no intention, no emotion, only momentum, only destiny. And in the black canvas of space, that was enough. But before the strike, before fire rained or the winds howled, Earth was alive in a way modern eyes rarely imagine. The landscape of North America alone stretched like an untouched canvas of wilderness. Rivers ran unpolluted and untamed. The sky bristled with birds so numerous they darkened the horizon. And humans, though few in number, had already begun carving their story into the land through migration, adaptation, and survival. They learned the movements of the megafauna, the cycles of ice and melt, and the subtleties of a world whose silence was broken only by nature itself. To them, the Earth was vast beyond comprehension, too large to ever truly change. Yet the clues these early people left behind tell us otherwise. Ancient campsites buried under layers of mysterious dark sediment, burned landscapes frozen in time, fragmented bones of animals that once ruled entire continents. Something interrupted this world, something violent, something sudden. Scientists looking back at this fragile period often describe the planet as unstable, but instability doesn't capture the true sense of looming tension. It's more accurate to say Earth was poised on a knife's edge. The ice sheets, thousands of meters thick, were already melting faster than usual, pouring fresh, cold water into the oceans. Atmospheric temperatures climbed year by year. The natural systems that governed climate were stretched thin, sensitive to the slightest push. If something, anything, were to disturb this delicate balance, the consequences could cascade across the globe. And that is exactly what the evidence hints at. A great forgetting sits between us and the world of our ancestors. Over millennia, civilizations rose and collapsed. Stories were embellished, languages transformed, and memories eroded like sand under relentless tides. But buried beneath myths, Atlantis, the Great Flood, divine punishment, cosmic wrath, there is a pattern too consistent to ignore. A pattern pointing to a real event, a real trauma, a real reset. 12,800 years ago, something happened. Something big enough to freeze oceans, drown continents, erase ecosystems, and nearly wipe humanity from the face of the earth. We stand today as descendants of its survivors, unaware of how close our species came to vanishing. The ancient storytellers may not have understood the science, but they remembered the fear. They remembered the darkness. They remembered the water. And now, by piecing together the silent whispers of geology, archaeology, and myth, we can begin retracing what truly unfolded during the forgotten apocalypse that reset civilization. The world before the catastrophe was a place of contrasts, warmth blooming at the edges of ice sheets, forests pushing northward, and rivers swollen with meltwater carving new paths across vast continents. Humanity lived close to the pulse of the land, yet remained unaware of the cosmic forces moving silently beyond their reach. In small groups scattered across North America, Europe, and Asia, people crafted tools from stone, bone, and ivory, traded pigments for painting caves, and followed herds across sprawling plains that no longer exist today. They lived lightly, but not insignificantly, leaving traces of their ingenuity in spear points, hearths, and intricate carvings that speak to a deeper understanding of their world than we often imagine. In their skies, the night was far darker than ours, an immense tapestry spangled with stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. Without the haze of modern life, they saw every comet's shimmer, every meteor's streak, every wandering light. To them, the heavens were not empty. They were active, alive, filled with meaning. Among these celestial wanderers may have been an object unlike the rest, larger, faster, fragmented, and moving along a trajectory that would eventually intersect with Earth's fragile atmosphere. They could not have known this. They could only watch, wonder, and record the unusual patterns in stories told around crackling fires. For them, the universe was a place of spirits and gods, not physics and orbit dynamics. And still, the signs were building. The ice sheets that blanketed Canada and northern Europe stood like frozen mountain ranges, towering above the landscape. Their edges melted into vast floodplains where roaring rivers carried torrents of glacial water southward. These sheets stored the equivalent of dozens of meters of sea level, immense reservoirs of ancient snow compressed into crystalline walls of ice. The release of even a fraction of that frozen mass would reshape the world. Nature understood the stakes. Humanity did not. Animals sensed subtle shifts long before humans did. Birds altered migration routes. Mammoths wandered into regions they rarely visited. Saber-toothed cats changed their hunting grounds. Whether instinct or chance, their movements became precursors of a coming imbalance. But humans, with short memories and fragile records, could not yet perceive that the Earth was entering a dangerous threshold, one susceptible to rapid change, amplification, and collapse. In this precarious climate, life was both abundant and vulnerable. The Clovis culture in North America, famed for its distinctive, beautifully fluted spear points, thrived as one of the most skilled hunting societies of the time. Their craftsmanship reflected a deep connection with the megafauna that provided food, tools, clothing, and shelter. These hunters moved with the seasons, tracking mammoth herds across wide, open basins carved by ancient winds. To them, the world's rhythms seemed eternal, bound to cycles they believed would always return. Yet beneath this surface of calm, Earth's climate system was preparing to lash out with unprecedented force. A single trigger was all it would take. Far above, in the cold emptiness of space, the intruder continued its silent drift, unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. It may have been a comet, loosely bound by ice and dust, fractured into many pieces over centuries of solar passes, or perhaps a fragment of a larger cosmic body, broken during ancient celestial collisions and set on a path that destiny reserved for Earth. Whatever its origin, it carried with it the energy of millions of nuclear bombs. If it arrived intact, it would carve craters large enough to swallow cities. If it fragmented in the atmosphere, it would unleash fire across continents. And still, no one on Earth knew. The people living then were focused on survival, stalking herds, gathering wild grains, tending small fires under open skies. Their oral traditions, rich, poetic, symbolic, captured the beauty and danger of their immediate world. But even these traditions held shadows of something older, hints of disasters passed down through generations. Tales of a darkened sky, of fire falling like rain, of animals fleeing and waters rising. These were warnings, but time had softened them into myth. Had anyone looked closely at the heavens in those final centuries before the impact, they might have noticed faint streaks of recurring meteors, a hint of the cosmic debris trailing the incoming object. They might have felt a chill while observing a sky that seemed unusually active. But humanity lacked the tools, the numbers, and the perspective to understand the scale of what approached. And so, life unfolded as it always had, quietly, rhythmically, obliviously. Hunters followed prey, rivers fed plains, glaciers melted drop by drop. The earth turned beneath a sun that rose and set without fail. Everything appeared stable until the moment it wasn't. For in the vast interplay of cosmic forces, timing is everything. And Earth's time was nearly up. Picture a world suspended at the edge of transformation, a planet breathing deeper with each passing century as the Ice Age slowly loosened its grip. 12,900 years ago, Earth was warming, not abruptly, not violently, but gradually, like a sleeping beast stirring from a long slumber. The glaciers, monstrous and ancient, began to retreat, their white walls peeling back to reveal dark soil and sprawling valleys that had not seen sunlight in tens of thousands of years. To the people alive then, these changes must have seemed subtle, almost invisible, unfolding across generations rather than lifetimes. But from a wider perspective, the planet was shifting, preparing for an era of profound ecological renewal. Life thrived in this delicate transition. In North America, the great megafauna reigned as undisputed rulers of the land. Mammoths marched across endless plains, their tusks sweeping gracefully through the air like arcs of polished ivory. Giant sloths lumbered in slow, deliberate movements, thick fur hanging from colossal frames. Herds of ancient bison rumbled across grasslands in numbers so vast they seemed like migrating continents. Predators followed them, dire wolves with bone-crushing jaws, saber-toothed cats whose fangs gleamed like curved daggers, and short-faced bears towering above any modern creature. These animals had survived ice, storms, and shifting landscapes for millennia. To them, the world's gradual warming posed no immediate threat. It was simply another chapter in a long cycle of adaptation. Humans lived among these giants, small in number but guided by sharp intelligence and instinct. Their camps dotted riverbanks, caves, and forest edges. They crafted tools of exquisite precision, stone spearheads fluted with skill that still confounds archaeologists today. They painted with pigments from crushed minerals, recorded hunts in flickering torchlight on cavern walls, and told stories beneath open skies filled with more stars than modern eyes have ever seen. They observed the land with an intimacy difficult to fathom now, sensing shifts in animal migrations, the texture of the wind, the arrival of seasons marked not by calendars but by the calls of birds and the movement of rivers. For these early communities, survival required harmony with nature's rhythms. They followed herds, adapted to cold snaps, and moved when resources dwindled. Though they possessed no cities, no written language, they were not primitive. Their knowledge was encoded in memory, in shared experience, in tradition passed from elders who had weathered countless winters. Their world was vast, untamed, and alive in ways modern landscapes rarely are. To them, the earth felt eternal, mountains fixed, seasons predictable, animals abundant. Nothing suggested that beneath this balance lay a fragile climate system vulnerable to disruption. Yet signs of instability were already brewing. The ice sheets, though shrinking, still held unimaginable quantities of fresh water, enough to raise sea levels by dozens of meters. Rivers swelled with meltwater each summer. Lakes burst through icy barriers, carving sudden channels into the land. Temperature patterns teetered between warming and cooling, sensitive to the slightest disturbance. But humans, focused on the immediate demands of the hunt and the hazards of daily life, could not detect the broader shift. Their world felt solid, dependable. At night, however, the clues were there, tiny streaks of light across the cosmos. Meteor showers, subtle but recurring, traced silent threads through the dark sky. To the people watching from below, these were omens, messages, or wandering spirits. They had no way of knowing that these glowing fragments might have been part of a larger cosmic pattern, debris perhaps foreshadowing something far more dangerous on its way. They looked upward in awe, unaware that the heavens, while beautiful, sometimes carried the seeds of destruction. The earth of that time was a canvas in motion, rivers shifting paths, forests expanding, ice retreating, animals adapting. Humanity thrived in the spaces between these colossal forces, unaware that everything they knew existed on borrowed stability. There was no reason for them to believe disaster was coming. No tremor in the ground, no growing darkness, no sign dramatic enough to warn them. The world felt as though it would continue warming, continue stabilizing, continue becoming more hospitable. But climates can change in an instant, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of the human gaze, the thing that would shatter this world was already on its way, an uninvited traveler drifting silently through space, closing the distance with every passing moment. Life in the late Pleistocene unfolded with a kind of quiet majesty, a balance so perfect it seemed almost timeless. Herds thundered across plains that stretched farther than the eye could see, their migrations carving ancient paths through grasses swaying like oceans of gold. Predators stalked after them, shaping the rhythm of life in an eternal cycle of chase and survival. Everything about the landscape spoke of abundance, resilience, and a natural order that had endured countless generations. Yet beneath this surface harmony, subtle tremors signaled a world vulnerable to change, a world only one unexpected push away from unraveling. In the northern hemisphere, the Laurentide and Eurasian ice sheets still towered over continents like frozen fortresses. Their sheer weight depressed the crust beneath them, their edges melted slowly into braided rivers that twisted through valleys newly exposed to sunlight. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the wilderness as glaciers calved, sending slabs the size of buildings tumbling into meltwater lakes. These massive ice bodies held the fate of coastlines, oceans, and weather patterns. They were sleeping giants, and even the slightest external shock could awaken them violently. Human activity wove through this world with delicate precision. Hunters studied the earth as if it were a vast library of signs, tracks pressed into mud, broken grass where mammoths passed, faint scents carried on the breeze. A single hunt could sustain a band for weeks, and each successful strike demanded cooperation, patience, and deep environmental awareness. Fires burned in the center of camps while stories drifted upward with the smoke, riddles, warnings, and tales of ancestors who had traversed similar landscapes. Children learned not through books, but by tracing spear points with their fingers, by listening to the rumble of distant herds, by watching the constellations rise and fall. If danger threatened this world, it came in whispers rather than declarations. Winters grew slightly harsher in some years, slightly milder in others. Storms rolled in from unfamiliar directions. Animals occasionally shifted territories, a sign that something was changing upstream in the ecological chain. But none of these variations were dramatic enough to provoke alarm. Climate had always fluctuated. The people knew cold, they knew hunger, they knew migrations that failed and seasons that turned unexpectedly. To them, these shifts seemed like nothing more than the ordinary breath of nature. Yet nature was holding its breath. Above the planet, far beyond the clouds, beyond the thin blue shell of atmosphere, a cosmic presence drifted along an invisible path. It approached slowly, without sound or warning. It did not burn brightly, did not announce itself with a long, flaming tail. It was merely a dark traveler against a darker sky, unseen from the surface of Earth. It might have been a comet fragment, its icy body fractured into clusters. It might have been debris from an older collision in some forgotten corner of the solar system. Whatever its origins, its arrival would coincide with a moment when Earth's climate system was precariously balanced, like a scale weighted evenly on both sides, needing only a feather's touch to tip into chaos. The animals sensed something first. Migration patterns became erratic. Mammoths lingered in places they normally would have abandoned before winter's return. Wolves traveled in unusual packs, stretching farther across plains in search of game that had dispersed unexpectedly. Birds, whose survival depended on celestial navigation, may have reacted to subtle changes in atmospheric composition or magnetic fields. Their flight paths shifted in a murmur of wings that hinted at an unease not yet reflected in the human world. To the people watching these patterns, it might have seemed like luck or misfortune depending on the season. A successful hunt one week, an empty valley the next. They adapted, as they always had. But no adaptation could have prepared them for what was drawing near. They lived as all humans had lived for tens of thousands of years, according to the rhythms of the earth, blind to the silent countdown unfolding above them. Night after night, the stars burned with ancient brilliance. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, guiding journeys and shaping myth. But within that glittering expanse, faint trails of meteoric debris occasionally streaked past, harmless, beautiful, easy to overlook. No one realized these tiny sparks foreshadowed something far greater, a celestial threat hidden within their same orbit. For now, the world still breathed in calm. Rivers flowed, herds grazed, fires crackled in the quiet dark. Humanity stood on the edge of an age-defining moment, unaware of how close the sky was to breaking open. The countdown to catastrophe had begun, though not a single soul on Earth could hear it. The day the sky changed may not have begun with fear. Maybe it started quietly, with mist clinging to the grass at dawn, with hunters preparing their tools, with mammoths grazing peacefully on the plains. But somewhere, on a horizon no one thought to watch, an unnatural glow began to bleed into the sky. At first it resembled the shimmering tail of a distant star, a pale streak dissolving into the morning light. But as hours passed, that glow intensified, sharpening into a fierce, white trail that cut across the heavens like a blade. Animals reacted instantly. Birds erupted from trees in frantic spirals. Herds clustered uneasily, stamping the ground, trumpeting warnings. Wolves barked at nothing. The air felt charged, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound. A low hum at first, almost like wind trapped inside a cavern. It grew steadily until it rippled through the earth, a vibrating pulse that shook bones and rattled teeth. People looked upward, and what they saw defied every story ever told around their fires. A massive, incandescent object streaked across the sky, brighter than the sun for a heartbeat, leaving behind a flaming trail that scorched itself into memory. It moved too fast for fear to register, too fast for comprehension. One moment the world was familiar. The next, it was illuminated by a brilliant white fire that turned shadows into ashes and day into blinding chaos. The object fragmented before anyone could understand what it was. A thunderous explosion split the sky, radiating shock waves that flattened forests and sent animals tumbling across the ground. The air ignited into a wall of heat so intense it incinerated vegetation in an instant, leaving vast swaths of land charred and blackened. Trees thousands of years old became pillars of flame that collapsed into smoldering embers. Fire swept across plains with terrifying speed, driven by winds born from the pressure wave. The true terror, however, came from fragments that struck the colossal ice sheets to the north. When superheated debris hit ice kilometers thick, it unleashed a fury beyond ordinary comprehension. Gigantic plumes of steam burst into the sky. Meltwater cascaded down in catastrophic floods, carving channels deep enough to be visible today. The impacts may have vaporized entire sections of ice, injecting unimaginable volumes of water and debris into the atmosphere. The earth shook as if giants were waking beneath it. For those who survived the initial blasts, the world transformed into a nightmare. The sky darkened, not gradually, but violently, choked by soot, ash, and microscopic particles lifted into the atmosphere. Daylight dimmed into a red, sickly glow. Animals fled blindly, crashing through burned forests and collapsing in exhaustion. Humans were forced to abandon their camps, running from fires that consumed everything behind them. The familiar landscapes they had known all their lives twisted into alien wastelands of black earth and suffocating smoke. The strangest thing was the cold that followed. After the fire and the thunder, after the heat waves that scorched the soil, a sudden stillness descended. The air, once blistering, cooled at a pace that defied nature. Within days, temperatures dropped sharply. Within weeks, they spiraled downward even faster. Lakes froze prematurely. Winds howled across plains stripped of vegetation. The sun remained dim, strangled by layers of debris so thick they altered global climate patterns. What had begun as a brief blaze in the sky was now reshaping the planet's systems, plunging the world toward a darkness deeper and more enduring than anyone could imagine. The survivors, few and scattered, must have felt utterly abandoned by the forces they once trusted. Their fires flickered weakly under a sky that no longer gave warmth. Their hunting grounds were barren, the megafauna disoriented or dying. The rules of survival had changed overnight. No elder's story, no ancestral memory, no tradition prepared them for a world where the cold returned like a predator. They did not know this moment had a name. They did not know scientists, thousands of years later, would call it a cosmic impact hypothesis. They only knew that everything they depended on, sunlight, warmth, animals, seasons, had been stolen in an instant. The world they had inherited was no longer the world they lived in. Something from the heavens had struck the earth with unimaginable force, and the countdown to an age of ice had truly begun. In the weeks that followed the Great Blast, the earth seemed to stagger under the weight of what had struck it. The fires still smoldered in vast, blackened fields, sending greasy plumes of smoke into a sky already darkened beyond recognition. Ash drifted like malignant snow, settling on rivers, animal hides, human skin. The air tasted metallic. Even the wind carried a strange heaviness, as if it struggled to move through an atmosphere choked with debris. The world had been wounded, not in a single place, but across an entire hemisphere, and every living creature felt the echo of that injury. The atmospheric chaos deepened as the planet attempted to rebalance itself. Sunlight dimmed to a pale imitation of day. A weak glow filtered through layers of soot, dust, and vaporized ice crystals. Without warmth, temperatures plunged rapidly. Nights became brutal, stretching long and bitter. Frost formed in regions that had not seen ice for centuries. Even the breath of survivors crystallized before their eyes. Plants wilted or died outright, unable to photosynthesize through the choking haze. Animals, deprived of food and warmth, began collapsing in staggering numbers. The climate had not merely shifted, it had snapped. The shock waves that tore through the continent had triggered avalanches along the edges of the great ice sheets. Massive fractures opened like wounded chasms, causing millions of tons of ice to break apart and crash into them. Oceans. These events unleashed sudden floods in some areas and abrupt freezes in others, reshaping coastlines and burying landscapes beneath new layers of ice. What had been a world of gradual thaw now lurched violently back toward glacial conditions. The transition was so abrupt that it defies the normal rhythms of planetary climate. It was as if the Earth had been thrust backward in time. For the humans scattered across these devastated regions, survival became a relentless battle. Their shelters, once nothing more than simple hide tents or wooden frames, were no match for the sudden freeze and ferocious winds. Hunters, who once relied on predictable migrations, now found the great herds decimated or vanished entirely. Mammoths and bison, disoriented by the changing climate, roamed erratically or succumbed to starvation. Many predators followed them into decline, incapable of adapting to the rapid collapse of their food chain. Bands of people began to move south in hopes of escaping the biting cold. They traveled through forests reduced to charcoal, trudged across plains littered with scorched bones, and navigated frozen rivers where steam still rose from places where firestorms had raged only days earlier. These journeys were marked by hardship, food shortages, illness, injuries, and the crushing psychological weight of witnessing the world they knew fall apart. Every step carried them deeper into uncertainty, yet even in the midst of catastrophe, human resilience endured. They learned to seek shelter in caves, using the Earth's warmth to shield themselves from the worst of the cold. They innovated new tools from whatever materials remained. They tracked the few surviving animals and adapted their hunting techniques to the harsher environment. Their stories changed, too, no longer mere tales of spirits and animals, but whispered recollections of fire falling from the sky, of the moment the world cracked open, of a force so powerful it reshaped the land itself. These stories would become the seeds of myths told thousands of years later, after languages evolved, after civilizations rose from the ashes of a world reset. In their earliest form, these memories were raw, vivid, and incomplete. The sky burned, the earth shook, darkness fell, winter returned. These fragments, passed from generation to generation, would drift through time and emerge in cultures far removed from the origins of the event. Flood narratives, fire legends, extinction stories, all echoing a shared trauma rooted in a cosmic intrusion. Meanwhile, the atmosphere refused to clear. Suspended particles continued to scatter sunlight back into space, reinforcing the sudden global cooling. The oceans, receiving vast amounts of fresh water from melted glaciers, disrupted circulation patterns that had stabilized the climate for thousands of years. Warm currents faltered, cold currents strengthened, storms intensified. The planet entered a feedback loop of plunging temperatures, swirling winds, and unpredictable seasons. This was not a temporary disturbance. It was the beginning of a new epoch, harsh, unforgiving, and relentless. The fire from the sky had ignited more than forests. It had ignited a chain reaction that humanity would be forced to endure for over 1,000 years. A long winter had settled over Earth, and its grip tightened with each passing season. For now, the fires were dying, the smoke was thickening, the cold was spreading. And somewhere within this spiraling chaos, the survivors realized the truth. They were no longer living in the world they had inherited. They were learning to live in the one that had replaced it, reborn through destruction, reshaped by a single devastating blow from the cosmos. The fire faded, but the cold remained, and it was unlike anything the Earth had seen in living memory. What followed was not a slow descent into ice, not the gentle creep of winter across centuries. It was abrupt, ruthless, and disorienting. Within a span so short it could fit inside a human lifetime, temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged dramatically. Regions that had supported grasslands and roaming herds were suddenly locked beneath frost and snow. Rivers stiffened into silent, frozen corridors. The land exhaled warmth one final time, then seemed to shut down. The sky never fully recovered its former clarity. Even after the smoke from the initial fires thinned, the atmosphere remained altered, its balance disrupted by dust, ash, and massive injections of freshwater vapor. Sunlight reached the surface weakly, filtered through a persistent veil that dulled colors and stole heat. Summers grew shorter, colder, and unreliable. Winters stretched longer, harsher, and merciless. Snow fell where rain once nourished soil. Ice advanced southward, reclaiming territory it had only recently surrendered. For the planet, this sudden reversal marked the onset of what scientists would later call the Younger Dryas, a return to mere glacial conditions that arrived without warning and lingered far longer than anyone could have endured willingly. The climate system, already strained, had flipped into a new state. Ocean currents slowed or changed direction as enormous volumes of cold freshwater poured into the seas from collapsing ice sheets. The delicate engine that distributed heat around the globe faltered, amplifying cold across continents. For living creatures, the impact was catastrophic. Plants that had begun spreading northward with the warming climate died back en masse. Forests thinned, then vanished, replaced by barren tundra and wind-swept steppe. Without vegetation to anchor soil, dust storms swept across exposed plains, scouring the land and further choking the atmosphere. Animals that depended on dense plant life starved. Those adapted to colder climates survived longer, but even they struggled against the speed of change. Evolution works over millennia. This freeze arrived in decades. Human survival teetered on the edge of collapse. Communities already weakened by fire, displacement, and food loss now faced an enemy they could not outrun. The cold crept into bones, into shelters, into every breath. Fires consumed precious fuel that was increasingly hard to find. Wood was scarce in frozen landscapes stripped of forests. Clothing made from hides stiffened in the cold, losing flexibility and warmth. Fingers numbed, tools cracked. Even simple tasks became dangerous. Hunting transformed from skill to gamble. The great herds that once sustained entire groups were fragmented or gone. Mammoths and bison struggled to find enough forage beneath snow and ice, their massive bodies requiring calories the land could no longer provide. Some fell through frozen riverbanks weakened by unpredictable thaws. Others simply wasted away, their remains scattered across plains as silent monuments to a collapsing ecosystem. Predators followed the dying herds into extinction, unable to adapt quickly enough. People moved constantly, driven by desperation rather than strategy. Southward migrations intensified, though the cold followed relentlessly. Familiar routes vanished under snow. Rivers froze too thick to cross safely, then thawed suddenly, becoming deadly traps. Caves became refuges not just from storms, but from a world that seemed intent on killing anything exposed. Inside these shelters, fires burned day and night, and stories changed tone, no longer celebrating abundance, but warning of a time when the sun weakened and winter refused to leave. Fear reshaped belief. The sky, once a source of guidance, became something to dread. The stars still shone, but they felt distant, indifferent. The sun rose low and pale, offering little comfort. Many must have believed the gods had turned away, or that some ancient law had been broken. Others may have clung to the hope that this was a passing trial, a test before balance returned. But seasons passed, and the cold did not retreat. The Earth had entered a deep freeze born not of slow orbital cycles, but of sudden disruption. Ice reclaimed the land, winds grew sharper, life contracted into pockets of survival scattered across a hostile world. The warmth of the previous age became a memory, already beginning to blur at the edges, preserved only in stories and longing. This was no ordinary winter. It was a planetary reset, an age of ice imposed by chaos, locking humanity into a struggle that would last for more than 1,000 years. As decades passed beneath the grip of the cold, the freeze revealed itself not as a temporary punishment, but as a new reality. Children were born into a world that had never known warmth, their earliest memories shaped by wind that cut like stone blades and skies that rarely brightened beyond a dull gray. For them, the idea of vast green plains and endless herds was already becoming legend, stories spoken softly by elders who feared those memories might fade entirely. What had once been abundance was now survival stripped to its rawest form. The ice sheets advanced with slow, relentless patience. Each year their edges crept farther south, swallowing valleys and erasing ancient paths beneath layers of compacted snow. Glaciers ground the land beneath them, pulverizing rock into fine powder that would later blanket the plains as thick loess. The weight of the ice depressed the Earth's crust, subtly warping landscapes and altering drainage patterns. Rivers rerouted themselves or vanished altogether, frozen solid or buried beneath ice. The geography humanity had memorized was rewritten beyond recognition. Oceans, too, responded violently to the planet's upheaval. With immense volumes of fresh water pouring in from melting and refreezing ice, global circulation systems weakened. Warm currents that once carried heat northward slowed, allowing polar cold to spread farther and persist longer. Storm systems intensified, driven by sharp temperature contrasts between air masses. Blizzards scoured the land, stripping exposed skin in minutes. Snowfall buried what little vegetation remained, locking food sources beneath layers too thick to penetrate. The megafauna continued to vanish. Some species lingered for generations, clinging to shrinking pockets of suitable habitat, but the momentum was irreversible. Mammoths, icons of the old world, became rarer with each passing century. Their bones accumulated in frozen riverbanks and windswept plains, preserved like time capsules in ice and sediment. To humans, these remains were both resource and warning, sources of ivory, bone, and memory. Each skeleton marked not only a death, but the slow extinction of an entire way of life. Human groups fragmented under the strain. Where once clans met seasonally to exchange tools, mates, and stories, now distance and danger made such gatherings rare. Isolation bred variation. Languages diverged, customs shifted. Survival strategies adapted to local conditions. Some groups mastering cold weather hunting, others retreating into forest refuges or coastal zones where the sea still offered sustenance. Innovation accelerated under pressure. Need sharpened creativity, forcing humanity to evolve culturally at a pace biology could not match. Spiritual beliefs hardened alongside the climate. The cold demanded explanation. The sky that had once burned with fire now withheld warmth, reinforcing the sense that cosmic forces governed human fate. Rituals emerged, centered on appeasing unseen powers, honoring ancestors who remembered a different world, or warning future generations never to forget what the heavens were capable of unleashing. Memory became sacred. Forgetting felt dangerous. Yet even amid relentless hardship, the Earth was quietly preparing for another shift. Beneath the ice, tensions built. The frozen reservoirs holding vast quantities of water were unstable, pressing against landscapes already fractured by fire and impact. The same forces that had driven the planet into cold were slowly setting the stage for its release. Humanity, locked in daily struggle, could not know that the long winter had an end. They only knew endurance. By the time the cold began to loosen its grip, more than 1,000 years would have passed. Entire generations would live and die without ever seeing the world their ancestors once knew. The Younger Dryas would carve itself deeply into human memory, not as a named event, but as an era of suffering, adaptation, and transformation. It would reshape ecosystems, redraw coastlines, and prune humanity down to its most resilient branches. The freeze had not destroyed civilization. It had prevented it from ever forming. And when warmth finally returned, it would do so violently, unleashing forces just as devastating as the cold that preceded them. When the cold finally settled into a grim routine, a quieter catastrophe unfolded alongside it. One that left no explosions, no firestorms, no single moment of terror. It happened gradually, relentlessly, and almost invisibly. The giants of the Ice Age began to disappear. Creatures that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, started to fail, one species after another, as if some unseen hand were erasing them from the world. At first, the changes were subtle. Herds grew thinner, migration routes shortened, calving seasons became erratic. Mammoths still walked the frozen plains, but their numbers no longer felt endless. Each winter claimed more of them than the last. The cold itself was not new to these animals. They were born of ice and snow, but the speed and instability of the climate proved lethal. The Younger Dryas did not offer consistent cold. It delivered violent swings, unpredictable freezes, sudden thaws, and shifting vegetation zones that undermined even the hardiest adaptations. The grasses mammoths relied upon struggled beneath prolonged snow cover. What little vegetation emerged during short summers lacked the nutritional density needed to sustain such massive bodies. Starvation weakened herds, making them vulnerable to disease and injury. Calves failed to survive their first winters in increasing numbers. Without enough young to replace the old, populations quietly collapsed. The land that once echoed with the thunder of thousands of feet grew unnervingly silent. Other megafauna followed the same path. Giant ground sloths, slow to reproduce and dependent on specific plant ecosystems, vanished as forests gave way to tundra. Saber-toothed cats, apex predators finely tuned to hunting large prey, found themselves without reliable food sources. Dire wolves and short-faced bears, built for dominance, could not survive in a world where prey was scarce and energy costs were high. Their extinction was not a single event, but a cascade, one loss triggering another. Humans were witnesses to this unraveling, and perhaps contributors, but not the masters of it. Hunting alone could not explain the sudden, near-simultaneous disappearance of so many species across entire continents. These animals had survived human presence for tens of thousands of years. What they could not survive was a climate system pushed beyond its limits. The cosmic impact and subsequent freeze had destabilized ecosystems so thoroughly that even minimal pressure became fatal. Across North America, the archaeological record tells a haunting story. Sites once rich with megafaunal remains abruptly fall silent. The distinctive tools associated with hunting mammoths disappear. Entire cultural traditions tied to these animals vanish alongside them. Humans adapted, shifting towards smaller game, fishing, and foraging, but the world they adapted to was poorer, stripped of its giants. For the people living through it, the loss must have felt apocalyptic in its own way. These animals were not just food. They were central to identity, mythology, and survival. Mammoths provided meat, fat, hides, bone, and ivory, resources that supported entire communities through brutal winters. Their disappearance forced humans to rethink everything: where to live, how to hunt, what to eat, and how to endure a world that no longer offered abundance. As centuries passed, the megafauna faded from living memory. Children grew up hearing stories of colossal beasts they would never see. These tales took on mythic qualities, giants of the past, creatures of a lost age, symbols of a world destroyed by divine anger or cosmic fire. Long after the bones lay buried beneath ice and sediment, the memory of the giants lingered in human imagination. The extinction of the megafauna was not merely biological, it was cultural. It severed humanity's last connection to the pre-catastrophe world. With the giants gone, the Ice Age world was truly over. What remained was a harsher, emptier Earth, and a species forced to survive without the creatures that had once shaped its destiny. Yet the disappearance of the giants was only part of the story. Beneath the ice and beneath the oceans, pressure was building. The same forces that had frozen the planet were quietly preparing to release unimaginable volumes of water. And when that release came, it would change the face of the Earth forever. As the centuries of cold dragged on, the absence of the great beasts began to reshape the planet in unexpected ways. Without mammoths trampling snow and compacting soil, grasslands changed character. Snow lingered longer on the ground, reflecting sunlight back into the atmosphere and reinforcing the cold. Shrubs and trees that once struggled against constant disturbance began to spread unevenly, altering entire ecosystems. The giants had been engineers of their environment, and with their disappearance, the land itself grew unfamiliar, even hostile to the life that remained. For humans, this ecological shift brought a profound reckoning. The strategies that had sustained their ancestors for generations no longer worked. Large game hunting, once the backbone of survival, became unreliable and dangerous. People were forced to diversify quickly, turning to smaller animals, fish, birds, roots, and wild grains. This transition demanded new tools, new knowledge, and new social structures. Cooperation became essential. Sharing food, pooling labor, and preserving knowledge meant the difference between endurance and extinction. In this harsher world, population numbers likely plummeted. Entire groups vanished without leaving traces, swallowed by cold, hunger, or isolation. Those who survived did so by adapting faster than ever before. They learned to store food, to insulate shelters more effectively, to read subtle environmental cues with heightened precision. Innovation was no longer optional. It was survival compressed into every decision. The pressure forged resilience, but it also narrowed humanity's margin for error to almost nothing. The disappearance of the megafauna also altered human psychology. The world felt diminished, stripped of its grandeur. Where once the horizon promised abundance, it now offered uncertainty. This loss seeped into storytelling. Myths grew darker, centered on destruction, punishment, and lost ages of greatness. The memory of a time when enormous creatures walked the earth became symbolic, a reminder that the world could change beyond recognition, that nothing, not even the mightiest beings, was guaranteed to endure. Across continents, the pattern repeated with eerie consistency. From North America to Eurasia, megafauna vanished within a relatively narrow window of time. Such synchronicity pointed to a cause larger than human hunting pressure alone. The climate shock, triggered by the cosmic event and sustained by the Younger Dryas freeze, had pushed ecosystems past their breaking point. Once destabilized, recovery became impossible. Extinction followed not as a sudden collapse, but as an inevitable conclusion. Beneath the ice sheets, immense tension continued to build. Glaciers, thickened by centuries of accumulation, pressed against landscapes already fractured by earlier impacts and floods. Meltwater pooled in vast subglacial lakes, trapped behind icy dams that strained under increasing pressure. These reservoirs held more water than modern seas could comfortably absorb. Their stability depended on the cold remaining absolute. But the climate, though still brutal, was beginning to change. Subtle shifts crept in: longer summers, slightly warmer winds, more frequent thaws along the ice margins. To humans, these changes offered fragile hope. To the ice, they spelled danger. Cracks spread. Pressure increased. The frozen barriers holding back unimaginable volumes of water weakened year by year. Few could have understood what this meant, but the Earth was preparing for another violent transformation. The giants were gone. The world was quieter, emptier, and scarred. Humanity, reduced and hardened, stood at the edge of yet another upheaval. The cold that had dominated life for over 1,000 years was losing its grip. And when it finally released, it would do so with catastrophic force, unleashing floods powerful enough to erase coastlines, drown entire lands, and imprint themselves permanently into human memory. What followed would not simply mark the end of an age of ice. It would mark the beginning of a flood age, one that would rewrite maps, reshape civilizations, and give birth to the most enduring legends humanity has ever told. The end of the long freeze did not arrive gently. It came abruptly, almost violently, as if the planet were snapping out of a prolonged fever. After more than 1,000 years locked in cold, the climate shifted with startling speed. Temperatures began to rise, not over millennia, not even over centuries, but within mere decades. For those living through it, the change must have felt unreal, a betrayal of everything they had come to understand about the world. Winters shortened. Summers grew longer and warmer. Ice that had dominated the horizon for generations began to thin, retreat, and collapse. The ice sheets responded first. Their surfaces darkened as melting exposed dust and debris long trapped within frozen layers. This darker surface absorbed more sunlight, accelerating the melt in a self-reinforcing cycle. Water poured across the ice in braided rivers, plunging into crevasses that reached down to the bedrock below. Entire sections of glacier destabilized, breaking apart with thunderous cracks that echoed across the land. What had once seemed immovable now behaved like something alive and angry. As the ice retreated, it released a force the world had never experienced. Trillions of tons of fresh water surged southward, overwhelming river systems that had been shaped for far smaller flows. Ancient valleys were scoured clean, hills were stripped of soil. The land was carved violently and irreversibly. In North America, massive torrents ripped across the continent, leaving behind scars so vast they remain visible today. Channels cut deep into basalt, landscapes gouged as if by colossal claws. These were not ordinary floods. They were continental-scale disasters. For humans, the warming was both salvation and terror. The cold loosened its grip, making survival marginally easier. Vegetation began to return in patches. Smaller animals flourished briefly in the renewed abundance. But the floods erased familiar territories. Campsites vanished overnight. Hunting grounds disappeared beneath raging waters. Entire groups were forced to flee repeatedly, chased not by cold, but by unstoppable waves of meltwater roaring across the land. The seas responded next. As glaciers collapsed and fresh water poured into the oceans, global sea levels began to rise at a pace no modern civilization has ever witnessed. Coastlines shifted inward year after year. Low-lying plains flooded permanently. Estuaries expanded. Saltwater intruded into freshwater systems, altering ecosystems beyond recognition. For coastal populations, the ocean ceased to be a boundary and became an advancing enemy. This warming phase was not stable. It was chaotic, marked by pulses of extreme melt, sudden floods, and unpredictable weather. Storms intensified as warm air collided with lingering cold. Rain fell in volumes that turned soil to mud and hillsides into rivers. Landslides reshaped valleys. Forests, newly reborn after centuries of cold, were torn apart almost as quickly as they emerged. To those who survived the ice, it must have felt as though the planet itself had lost restraint. First fire from the sky, then endless cold. Now water, everywhere, all at once. The Earth was not returning to balance. It was lurching from one extreme to another, and humanity, small and scattered, could only react. Yet this moment marked something profound. The Ice Age was truly ending. The Holocene, the relatively stable epoch that would allow agriculture, cities, and civilization to emerge, was beginning. But its birth was anything but peaceful. It was delivered through destruction, displacement, and overwhelming force. The world that followed would be new, unfamiliar, and reshaped by water. The greatest floods were still to come. As the warming accelerated, the true scale of the melt became impossible to ignore. The great ice sheets, once locked in place by unrelenting cold, began to fail catastrophically. Vast walls of ice collapsed into meltwater lakes that had been silently growing for centuries, trapped behind fragile frozen dams. When those dams gave way, the result was sudden and apocalyptic. Entire inland seas emptied in a matter of days, unleashing floods that surged with enough force to strip bedrock bare. In what is now North America, these floods tore across the landscape with unimaginable violence. Water raced faster than any river ever had, carrying boulders the size of houses and grinding them into the earth like tools of destruction. The land was scoured clean, leaving behind enormous channels, dry waterfalls hundreds of feet tall, and vast ripple marks etched into stone, signatures of water moving at a scale that defies modern experience. These scars remain today as silent witnesses to a time when continents themselves were reshaped in weeks. Human survival during this period depended entirely on movement and luck. Communities that settled too close to meltwater channels vanished without trace. Those who escaped did so by retreating to higher ground, following instinct rather than knowledge. Rivers that once provided food and stability transformed into corridors of death. Entire coastlines retreated inland as rising seas devoured lowlands permanently. What had been familiar geography dissolved, year by year, forcing people to abandon ancestral territories and memories alike. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical destruction. For generations, humanity had endured cold and hunger, believing the ice to be the ultimate enemy. Now, just as warmth returned, water became the new threat. The sense of betrayal deepened. Nature seemed unpredictable, even malicious, capable of offering relief with one hand while erasing entire worlds with the other. Survival required constant vigilance. No place felt permanent. No land felt safe. As ice melted in the northern hemisphere, sea levels rose rapidly across the globe. Island chains vanished. Continental shelves flooded. Shallow seas expanded into regions that had once supported forests, animals, and human settlements. The pace of this rise was staggering, measured not in millimeters per year, but in meters over centuries, and in violent pulses that drowned coastlines within a single lifetime. Humanity watched the ocean advance, powerless to stop it. The climate, though warming overall, remained unstable. Sudden cold snaps alternated with intense heat. Storms lashed coastlines newly exposed to open water. Rain fell in torrents, triggering floods even far from glacial sources. This instability delayed any return to long-term ecological balance. The planet was still releasing stored energy, still adjusting to the shock imposed thousands of years earlier. Yet amid the chaos, new possibilities emerged. As ice retreated fully from certain regions, fertile land appeared, fresh soil rich in minerals ground by glaciers. Plants colonized rapidly. Animals followed. Humans, driven by necessity, began experimenting with new ways of living. They lingered longer in favorable locations, harvested wild grains, and learned to anticipate seasonal changes in a warming world. These small adaptations laid the foundation for something unprecedented. But before stability could take hold, one final catastrophic surge awaited, an event so immense it would drown entire continents and imprint itself permanently into human memory. The greatest flood was still building, gathering behind collapsing ice sheets and rising seas. When it arrived, it would not merely reshape the land. It would erase it. The water did not arrive as a gentle rise of the tide. It came as a surge, sudden, overwhelming, and unstoppable. At a moment when the planet was already destabilized by melting ice and shifting climates, the Earth released one of the largest floods in its history. Oceans swelled, not slowly, but in violent pulses. Sea levels climbed with terrifying speed, advancing inland year after year, sometimes swallowing entire regions within a single human lifetime. What followed would later be known as one of the most dramatic meltwater events the world has ever endured. Behind the collapse of this flood lay the failure of immense ice reservoirs that had accumulated during centuries of freezing. As temperatures rose, these frozen barriers weakened until they could no longer hold back the colossal volumes of water pressing against them. When they broke, the release was catastrophic. Fresh water poured into the oceans in quantities so vast that global sea levels jumped abruptly, drowning coastlines across every continent. Forests vanished beneath waves, plains transformed into shallow seas, rivers reversed direction under the pressure of the rising ocean. For those living near the coast, the change must have felt unreal. The shoreline crept closer each season, swallowing camps, trees, and hunting grounds. Salt water invaded freshwater sources, poisoning rivers and lakes that had sustained life for generations. Fish populations shifted unpredictably. Land animals fled inland, competing for shrinking territory. People were forced to retreat again and again, abandoning familiar landscapes that disappeared beneath the waves. In some regions, the flooding was sudden and violent. Walls of water surged through river valleys, ripping apart everything in their path. These floods carried debris, ice, and sediment across enormous distances, burying landscapes beneath thick layers of mud and sand. Entire ecosystems were erased in days. Where life had flourished, only silence remained. The land itself bore the scars. Massive channels were carved into rock, shaped by water moving at impossible speeds. Giant ripple marks formed on the seafloor and across plains, structures so large they could only have been created by floods of unprecedented scale. These features remain etched into the earth today, undeniable evidence of a watery force far beyond anything recorded in human history. Humanity, already reduced and scattered by ice and extinction, now faced annihilation by water. Survival depended on elevation and timing. Those who reached higher ground lived. Those who hesitated were lost. Families were separated. Knowledge vanished with the people who carried it. The trauma of watching the sea consume the world became etched into memory, passed down as warnings, as myths, as sacred stories meant to ensure such horror was never forgotten. This flood did not occur once, but in pulses. Each surge pushed the ocean farther inland, claiming more land, more lives. The world map was being redrawn in real time. Vast regions that had been home to humans and animals for thousands of years disappeared beneath rising seas, leaving only shallow continental shelves and submerged plains as silent reminders of what had been lost. For the survivors, the flood marked the end of the old world more definitively than fire or ice ever had. The land of their ancestors was gone, erased beneath water too deep to cross, too vast to challenge. They were forced to adapt to a smaller, harsher planet, one with fewer resources, fewer safe places, and fewer memories of what once existed. And yet, even as the waters rose, humanity endured. Those who lived would carry the memory of the flood forward, embedding it into stories of gods, punishment, and rebirth. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, echoes of this moment would resurface, tales of a great deluge that wiped the world clean and spared only a few. The flood was not a legend. It was a geological reality, and its consequences were only beginning to unfold. As the waters continued to rise, the true scale of loss became impossible to comprehend. Entire worlds vanished beneath the surface, not metaphorically, but physically. Landscapes that had supported generations of human life were erased so completely that no trace remained above water. What had once been forests, valleys, and hunting grounds became shallow seas, their former existence preserved only in submerged contours and buried sediments. The ocean did not pause, did not recede. It claimed and kept what it took. Across the planet, coastlines retreated inland at astonishing speed. In Southeast Asia, vast lowlands connecting modern islands dissolved beneath encroaching seas. In Europe, plains that had once linked Britain to the continent disappeared forever. Along every continental edge, humans were pushed inward, compressed into shrinking territories where competition for resources intensified. Migration was no longer a choice. It was a necessity imposed by water that refused to stop. The floods did more than drown land. They rewired ecosystems. Saltwater overwhelmed river systems, killing freshwater species and transforming fertile estuaries into unstable brackish zones. Coral reefs struggled to adapt to rapid changes in depth and temperature. Marine life migrated, collapsed, or flourished unpredictably, creating chaotic food webs. On land, animals unfamiliar with coastal environments were forced into new habitats, often already occupied, accelerating extinction and conflict. For humans, the flood fractured continuity. Knowledge tied to specific landscapes, Seasonal routes, sacred sites, reliable food sources was lost when those places disappeared. Oral traditions strained under the weight of trauma as survivors tried to explain what they had witnessed. How do you describe a land that sinks? How do you prepare children for a sea that advances year after year? In the absence of scientific understanding, memory transformed into story. The flood became a moral lesson, a divine act, a cosmic cleansing, anything that gave meaning to incomprehensible loss. Some groups adapted by turning toward the sea itself. Fishing, shellfish gathering, and coastal navigation became essential skills. Simple watercraft evolved into lifelines, allowing movement across flooded regions and access to new food sources. Others retreated deep inland, avoiding the coast entirely, carrying with them stories of a world swallowed whole. These divergent paths would later shape cultural identities, separating maritime peoples from inland societies. The Earth, meanwhile, began to stabilize, slowly, reluctantly. After the most violent pulses of meltwater, sea levels continued rising but at a reduced pace. The atmosphere cleared. Sunlight strengthened. Weather patterns became more predictable. The chaos did not end overnight, but the worst had passed. The planet was settling into a new equilibrium, one vastly different from anything that had existed before. What emerged was a transformed world. Continents were smaller, oceans were larger, island chains replaced plains, shallow seas covered former homelands. Humanity now inhabited a planet reshaped by extremes, fire, ice, and water, layered one upon the other. The survivors carried scars not only in memory, but in culture, belief, and behavior. Stability, when it returned, was treated with suspicion. The Earth had proven it could change without warning. The Great Flood became the final severing point between the ancient world and the one that followed. Everything before it belonged to a lost age. Everything after it would build upon survival rather than abundance. From this broken continuity, something new would eventually rise, not immediately, not easily, but inevitably. The waters receded no further. The land that had vanished would never return. And from the silence beneath the waves, the memory of the flood would echo through time, waiting to resurface when humanity was ready to listen again. When the waters finally slowed their advance, the world that remained was smaller, fragmented, and unfamiliar. Humanity stood on the shores of a transformed planet, gazing out over seas that concealed entire landscapes beneath their surface. What had been solid ground for countless generations now lay drowned in silence, its rivers, forests, and pathways erased from the living world. These were not isolated losses, but continental-scale disappearances, vast territories swallowed so completely that only memory could testify they had ever existed. In Southeast Asia, one of the greatest land masses ever inhabited by humans vanished beneath rising seas. A vast lowland once connected modern-day Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and surrounding regions into a single expanse of forests, rivers, and fertile plains. This land had supported dense populations of animals and humans alike, offering abundant food and stable climates during the long ice age. As the oceans rose, this enormous territory was gradually consumed, breaking into islands and scattering its people across what would later become the Indonesian archipelago. Entire cultures were displaced, forced to adapt to life on smaller islands or retreat inland, carrying with them stories of a homeland lost to the sea. Far to the northwest, a similar fate unfolded across Europe. A broad plain once stretched between what is now Britain and mainland Europe, a land of rolling hills, marshes, and rivers rich with fish and game. Humans hunted, gathered, and settled there for thousands of years, unaware that the ocean waited patiently at its edges. As meltwater surged into the Atlantic, The sea crept inward, flooding valleys and cutting off high ground until the land fractured and disappeared entirely. What had once been a thriving region became a shallow sea, leaving behind only submerged contours and scattered artifacts buried beneath layers of sediment. These losses were not instantaneous, but they were relentless. Year after year, familiar landmarks vanished, camps were abandoned, migration routes ended abruptly at water's edge. The psychological toll was immense. People were forced to confront a reality where even the ground beneath their feet could not be trusted to remain. The sense of permanence that anchors human settlement dissolved, replaced by caution and impermanence. For those who survived the inundations, the drowned lands took on a mythic quality. They were remembered as golden ages, as ancestral homelands where life had been easier, richer, more abundant. Stories spoke of fertile plains swallowed overnight, of forests where the sea now ruled, of cities or gathering places lost beneath the waves. These memories, reshaped by time and retelling, became the foundation of legends that would endure for millennia. The physical evidence of these lost worlds remained hidden beneath the ocean's surface. Submerged river channels traced ghostly paths across continental shelves. Ancient shorelines marked former coastlines, now dozens of meters below modern sea level. Stone tools and hearths lay buried in sediments, waiting for a future age to rediscover them. The planet itself remembered, even when humanity could not fully articulate what had been taken. As the Holocene dawned, humanity was no longer living on the same Earth its ancestors had known. The loss of these lands compressed populations, intensified competition, and forced innovation. People learned to navigate coastlines, to read tides, to survive in fragmented environments. The sea, once a boundary, became both barrier and pathway, a force of destruction and connection intertwined. Yet beneath these adaptations lingered a deeper unease. If the ocean could rise once and erase entire worlds, could it do so again? That question haunted human memory, whispered through generations, embedded in stories meant to warn as much as to remember. The lost lands were gone forever, but their shadow stretched far into the future, shaping how humanity would understand its place on an unstable planet. As generations passed, the memory of the drowned lands slowly transformed. What had once been lived experience became inherited knowledge, then symbolic story, then sacred warning. The survivors spoke of ancestral homelands now hidden beneath endless water, places of abundance that existed before the world changed. Over time, these recollections grew larger than life. The lost lands became idealized, perfect, harmonious, closer to the gods. In memory, they were not merely places that vanished, but worlds that had been taken away. These stories traveled with migrating peoples, crossing mountains, deserts, and seas. Though cultures diverged, the core themes remained eerily consistent. A prosperous land, a sudden catastrophe, rising waters, and a small number of survivors who carried knowledge forward. Separated by thousands of miles and countless generations, human societies would one day record these tales as myths, stories of sunken kingdoms, divine floods, and civilizations erased for reasons both moral and cosmic. The geography changed, the names changed, but the trauma remained intact. The sea itself became a keeper of secrets. Beneath its surface lay valleys shaped by rivers, coastlines etched by waves, and plains once walked by humans and animals alike. Fish swam above former forests. Coral reefs grew atop drowned hills. What had been land transformed into a new kind of world, inaccessible, yet not destroyed. The ocean concealed these places so thoroughly that, for most of history, humanity could only speculate about what lay below. Without tools to explore the depths, The drowned landscapes existed only in imagination. Yet the planet never truly erased them. Submerged land bridges and continental shelves preserved the outlines of lost territories like fossils frozen in time. The seafloor still carried the memory of ancient rivers and shorelines, waiting for an age capable of reading them. Thousands of years later, sonar and satellite mapping would reveal these ghostly features, confirming that the legends were rooted in real geography. What myth preserved emotionally, geology preserved physically. For humanity, life on a smaller planet demanded new ways of thinking. Fragmented lands encouraged regional identities. Coastal societies learned to rely on the sea not just for food, but for movement and trade. Boats became extensions of survival, allowing people to reconnect across waters that had once been land. Inland groups, cut off from these maritime networks, developed differently, adapting to forests, rivers, and plains reshaped by post-glacial climates. Diversity flourished, born from isolation imposed by rising seas. Still, the memory of loss lingered. The idea that the world could change catastrophically became embedded in human consciousness. Stability was no longer assumed. Settlements were chosen with care. High ground held symbolic value. Sacred stories warned against hubris, against ignoring signs from nature or the sky. Whether consciously or not, humanity carried forward lessons forged during catastrophe. The earth is powerful, unpredictable, and capable of wiping clean what it has allowed to grow. These lessons would shape the next great transformation. As the climate stabilized and resources slowly returned, humans began to linger longer in fertile regions. Seasonal camps became semi-permanent. Knowledge accumulated rather than vanishing with each migration. The survivors of the flood were no longer just enduring. They were remembering, preserving, and preparing. From the ruins of drowned lands, something new was emerging. Not yet civilization, but the conditions that would make it possible. The trauma of loss had compressed humanity into closer proximity, forcing cooperation, experimentation, and cultural memory. The old world was gone, but its shadow guided what came next. And in one region, soon after the waters stabilized, humanity would build something unlike anything seen before. A place of stone, symbolism, and memory, rising not from abundance, but from survival itself. When the waters finally slowed and the climate began to steady, humanity did not rush to rebuild the world it had lost. There were no attempts to reclaim drowned lands, no grand projects to tame nature, no immediate return to permanence. Instead, something quieter and far more profound took place. The survivors began to remember. Not in the way history remembers dates or names, but in the way trauma reshapes instinct. Those who lived through fire from the sky, 1,000 years of ice, and oceans that swallowed continents, learned lessons that could not be unlearned. The world was not stable. The sky was not benign. The land itself could vanish. These were not abstract ideas, they were lived truths, carved into memory by loss. What mattered most after the catastrophe was not technology, not architecture, not dominance over nature, but knowledge of how to endure it. The survivors carried an understanding that had been paid for with extinction. Never trust long-term stability too easily. Never depend on a single food source. Never settle where escape is impossible. Flexibility became wisdom. Mobility became security. Memory became survival. This knowledge was not written down. Writing did not yet exist. Instead, it was encoded into stories, rituals, and taboos, systems designed not to explain the world, but to warn about it. Myths of angry skies, of floods sent without mercy, of worlds destroyed for reasons beyond human control were not primitive fantasies. They were compressed data, simplified so they could survive transmission across generations that might never again witness such events. Certain behaviors emerged across widely separated cultures with no direct contact, yet striking similarity. People favored high ground. They avoided low, enclosed valleys. They treated coastlines with caution and reverence. The sea was respected, feared, personified. The sky became sacred, unpredictable, powerful. These patterns were not coincidence. They were inheritance. Even the structure of belief shifted. Nature was no longer something to be mastered, it was something to be negotiated with. Rituals formed around appeasement rather than conquest. Seasonal movements were timed not just to resources, but to risk. Elders held authority not because of strength, but because they remembered more, because memory itself had become the most valuable resource. What looks to us like superstition may have been rational behavior shaped by catastrophe. Taboos against building too close to water. Stories warning that the land once disappeared. Sacred prohibitions tied to certain stars or celestial events. These were not errors in understanding. They were safeguards. Forgetting was dangerous. Remembering was life-preserving. This is why the world did not immediately leap into civilization when the climate warmed. The survivors did not see stability as opportunity. They saw it as something temporary, possibly deceptive. They had lived through a time when the Earth changed faster than culture could adapt. Caution was not weakness. It was intelligence forged under pressure. The knowledge they carried forward was invisible to archaeology. It left no monuments, no ruins, no artifacts grand enough to command attention. But it shaped behavior for generations. It delayed settlement. It favored resilience over expansion. It kept humanity light on the land, ready to move, ready to abandon, ready to survive again if necessary. In this sense, the true legacy of the apocalypse was not destruction. It was restraint. A species that had learned, at great cost, that the world could reset itself without warning. And that lesson would govern human choices long after the floodwaters stilled. But memory alone cannot hold back time. As generations passed without catastrophe, fear slowly softened. Stability, once distrusted, began to feel real. And when that happened, humanity faced a new question, one that would change everything. When is it finally safe to build? The decision to build a permanent world did not come from ambition. It came from silence. Generations passed without fire falling from the sky, without ice swallowing the land, without seas advancing inland. The earth, for the first time in living memory, remained calm. Seasons followed predictable rhythms. Rivers stayed within their banks. Coastlines held their shape. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fear that had governed survival began to loosen its grip. This is why civilization waited. For thousands of years after the catastrophe, humanity possessed the intelligence to farm, to settle, to store food. What it lacked was trust. Trust that the land would remain. Trust that the climate would not betray them again. Trust that permanence would not become a death sentence. Building a village, planting crops, investing labor in a single place meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had once nearly erased the species. Only when the world proved stable over multiple generations did that calculation change. As the Holocene climate settled into relative equilibrium, people began to linger longer in fertile regions. Seasonal camps became semi-permanent. Knowledge accumulated rather than dispersing with each migration. Experiments with wild grains and animals slowly became intentional cultivation. Not because humanity had suddenly become more advanced, but because the risk had finally dropped low enough to justify commitment. Civilization, in this view, was not an explosion of genius. It was a cautious response to prolonged safety. The memory of catastrophe did not vanish. It transformed. The stories remained, but their urgency faded. Flood myths became moral tales rather than survival warnings. Sky gods turned from destroyers into judges. What had once been instruction became allegory. As fear softened, confidence grew. Humans began to believe they could shape the world rather than merely endure it. Yet the imprint of the past never fully disappeared. Early cities were often built on high ground. Sacred spaces faced the sky. Flood narratives persisted across continents, strangely consistent in structure despite cultural distance. These were echoes, faint but real, of a time when nature had proven absolute dominance. Civilization rose on the shoulders of survivors who had delayed it deliberately. Their restraint allowed humanity to wait for a window of stability rare in geological history. Agriculture, urbanization, and technological growth flourished only because the climate remained forgiving long enough to support them. The world did not change humans first. Humans waited for the world to stop changing. And this realization carries an uncomfortable truth. Everything that defines modern civilization, cities, infrastructure, global networks, exists because the Earth has been unusually stable for the last 12,000 years. That stability is the exception, not the rule. The long silence after the apocalypse made civilization possible, but it also made forgetting inevitable. We are the descendants of people who remembered too well. We are also the heirs of a world calm enough to let us forget. The lesson they carried was simple, though easily ignored. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is a temporary arrangement between humanity and nature, one that exists only as long as the Earth allows it. When the survivors finally chose to build, they did so believing the worst was over. And for a very long time, they were right. The question that remains is whether we still understand the price they paid to earn that belief. We often imagine ourselves as the beginning of history. Modern, informed, protected by science and technology, standing at the peak of a long, steady climb. But the deeper truth is far less comforting. We are not the beginning. We are the continuation, the inheritors of a story that almost ended before it truly began. Every human alive today descends from a narrow line of survivors, people who endured a planetary-scale catastrophe and adapted when extinction was the more likely outcome. The population bottleneck that followed fire, ice, and flood reduced humanity to a fraction of its former numbers. Entire lineages vanished. Entire ways of life disappeared without record. What remained was not the strongest or the most advanced, but the most adaptable. Those who could move, remember, cooperate, and endure. This is the real reset of civilization. The apocalypse 12,800 years ago did not destroy cities because cities did not yet exist. It destroyed potential. It erased the ecological stability that would have allowed complexity to emerge earlier. It forced humanity into survival mode for over 1,000 years, delaying progress not because of ignorance, but because of caution. The survivors learned that building too much, trusting too deeply, and anchoring oneself too firmly to the land could be fatal. That lesson shaped everything that followed. When agriculture finally appeared, it did so in multiple places, independently, as if humanity had been waiting for a signal. When settlement began, it was tentative. Early villages were fragile, experimental, easily abandoned. Civilization did not explode into existence. It crept forward, testing the earth at every step, watching for signs of betrayal. Even writing, when it emerged, was first used not for poetry or philosophy, but for accounting, storage, and control, tools of risk management. The myths we inherited are not relics of ignorance. They are warnings filtered through time. Flood stories, sky gods, cycles of destruction and rebirth, these are not coincidences of imagination. They are cultural scars. Humanity remembered that the world could change suddenly, violently, and without moral logic. The language of gods was the only framework available to express forces that dwarfed human understanding. And yet, as centuries turned into millennia, the memory dulled. Stability bred confidence. Confidence bred expansion. Expansion bred the belief that nature was something to be mastered rather than negotiated with. We built cities on floodplains. We carved coastlines into infrastructure. We assumed the climate that nurtured civilization would continue indefinitely because it always had, within our limited memory. But 12,000 years is not a rule. It is a pause. The survivors of the ancient apocalypse understood something we struggled to accept. Civilization exists at the mercy of forces far larger than itself. The Earth does not operate on human timescales. It shifts suddenly, resets violently, and recovers without regard for what it erases. Fire from the sky, collapsing ice, rising seas, these are not fantasies. They are part of the planet's natural history. We live in the aftermath of the last reset, not beyond the reach of the next. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means awareness matters. The people who survived the end of the Ice Age did so because they adapted faster than the world changed. They remembered. They shared knowledge. They respected instability. Their legacy is not fear. It is humility. And that legacy has been passed to us, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. The question now is not what ended the last world. The question is whether we would recognize the signs if the Earth began preparing to do it again. If the past teaches us anything, it is that catastrophe does not announce itself clearly. It arrives quietly, hidden within normality, masked by familiarity. The people who lived before the last Great Reset did not see the end coming. They saw warming climates, abundant animals, expanding landscapes. They believed the world was opening, not closing. By the time the sky burned and the seas rose, there was no time left to prepare, only to endure. We are not so different. Our world feels permanent because it is all we have ever known. Coastlines appear fixed, seasons seem reliable. Technology gives the illusion of control. But the Earth beneath us is the same restless system it has always been. Ice still melts. Oceans still rise. The sky still carries objects capable of altering the course of life in a single moment. None of this has changed. Only our confidence has. The survivors of the ancient apocalypse did not leave us machines or monuments that could warn us directly. They left something more subtle, a pattern, a repeating cycle of expansion, collapse, memory, forgetting, and rebirth. Civilization grows during rare windows of stability, flourishes while conditions allow it, and becomes vulnerable when it forgets that stability is temporary. That cycle is written not in prophecy, but in geology, climate records, and buried landscapes beneath the sea. What makes our moment unique is not our immunity to catastrophe, but our awareness of it. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the ability to see the planet as a system, to detect asteroids, to measure climate shifts, to read the scars left by past disasters. We can identify the fingerprints of ancient floods, sudden freezes, and cosmic impacts. We can reconstruct the story our ancestors could only encode in myth. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Awareness without humility leads to complacency. Technology without memory leads to overconfidence. The lesson of 12,000 years ago is not that disaster is guaranteed, but that denial is dangerous. The survivors endured because they respected uncertainty. They adapted their behavior to a world they knew could change without warning. They delayed progress not out of fear but out of wisdom earned through loss. Modern civilization has inherited the benefits of an unusually calm epoch. That calm allowed agriculture, cities, science, and global connection to emerge. But it has also allowed us to forget why patience and restraint once mattered so deeply. We build as if the ground will never shift. We plan as if the climate will remain obedient. We assume tomorrow will resemble today because yesterday always did. That assumption is the true vulnerability. The story of the forgotten apocalypse is not meant to inspire dread. It is meant to restore perspective. Humanity has faced planetary catastrophe before and survived. Not through dominance, but through cooperation, memory, and adaptation. We are here because our ancestors learned when to move, when to wait, and when to rebuild. Their legacy lives in us. We are not the first civilization to inherit a fragile world. We are simply the latest. Whether we become the next lost chapter or the generation that finally understands the rhythm of the earth depends on whether we choose to remember what the survivors already knew. The past is not gone. It is beneath our feet, beneath our oceans, written into stone and ice. The question is not whether the earth can reset civilization again. The question is whether we will recognize the warning signs before it does. And that is why this story matters.